So, what is progressive rock? There's never been a definitive definition. Frank Zappa said that it's stuff that doesn't sound like regular rock. And that's as good a definition in my book as any. And so then comes to the question, where is progressive rock? And I suppose an easy answer would be it was never on AM radio. But in terms of where in the world it was, it's generally thought of as a primarily UK-based art form in terms of its origins and in terms of the bands that had the most success with it. One could point to anything from Sgt. Pepper's to the first Procol Harum album to the Days of Future Past, the breakout album by the Moody Blues, some of the stuff that Keith Emerson and the Nice were doing. And the list goes on. And then the question is, what's the difference between progressive rock and jazz fusion? And that's where it gets interesting, because if it's a British or European band that's fusing rock with a lot of classical and maybe a bit of jazz and a bit of improv, it tends to be called prog rock. And if it's a North American band that's fusing together a lot of jazz, maybe a bit of blues, maybe a bit of avant-garde music, and the rock format, then it tends to be called fusion. But a lot of this has more to do with origins of the musicians and the audiences to which the music is marketed than anything else. And that's how we come to America's best prog rock band, in my view, and that is Kansas. They not only defy all of these labels, but they also mix the stereotypes together to create something that is very, very fresh. And that there wasn't anything like them before, and there really hasn't been since. Kansas were a very interesting band in that the guys were all really committed to music. They loved music. Some people get into it for the fame, some get into it to escape. But for these guys, it was really all about the music. They played and played and played. And once the right people in the music industry got to hear what they were doing, their virtuosity became very, very apparent because every single one of them was a virtuoso on their on their instrument. You had two guitars, keyboards, drums, bass, and violin, which Robbie Steinhardt's violin was in many ways something that made them stand apart from most prog rock bands. You had things like electric violin in what they called fusion, Mahavishnu Orchestra, which Jean-Luc Ponty became a member of in the second lineup. He, of course, was already established in his own right, but in this context, there was something very different because Robbie Steinhardt played the violin more like a country and Western fiddle than like a European trained musician who then got into jazz at a very early age. Jean-Luc Ponty was sort of Stéphane Grappelli for a modern sensibility. Pardon me. It's that Kansas dust that gets in here. But Kansas were a lot more than a rock band with a violin, though they were that. They were a band of such intricate and virtuosic music, but they never tried to sound like transatlantic hard rock. They never tried to sound like the big UK prog rock bands, your ELPs, your Genesises, your Yes. Nor did they try to sound like Southern rock, the Leonard Skinnards of the world, people like that. They really carved out a totally unique sound, and they did it by refusing to compromise on their musical abilities and their abilities as writers. They had quite a few albums before they really hit it big. Their biggest album was, of course, Left Overture. That's a pun, of course, from 1976. It was their fourth album, but the three that came before it were musically excellent, and they were all recorded very well, great production. But Left Overture really became their quintessential album because it had a huge hit, which is something that always evaded Kansas before that. And this used some of the same sort of musical tendencies and motifs as some of their earlier music. Dramatic chords, interesting solos that could run the gamut from blues bass to European classical influence. And so all of the ingredients were there. But on this album, it starts off with a hit. And this was, of course, Carry On Wayward Son. a song that's been immortalized not only because of its popularity worldwide, but of course, there was a South Park episode that mocked the kids playing the song on Guitar Hero. And then when Stan Marsh's father, Randy, gets out a real guitar and plays the riff, and sings along actually really well, and the kids aren't interested because the playing musical instruments are for old people. It's an interesting episode with a lot of interesting commentary about early 2000s perceptions of music from the people that were at that time young. But Kansas has endured because they continued to create hits. And one of their other really huge hits was something that was uncharacteristic, and this was a soft ballad. This was from their next album called Point of No Return, and this was, of course, Dust in the Wind. It's a song that you'll hear on many solemn occasions. It's almost like a secular hymn to the heartland, and it's about loss, and it's about grief, and it's about life and its meaningfulness or meaninglessness, depending on your point of view. So by the mid 70s, not only were they able to have consistently proved themselves as virtuosic musicians who could write interesting songs, but they were able to write hits, huge hits on Rock FM radio that didn't compromise their musical integrity. And that is very unique. They continued to make albums into the early 80s, although the lineup became a bit less stable. One of the things that differentiates them from almost every prog rock band apart from Rush of Canada was that through their golden 70s and very early 80s period, their lineup remained rock solid stable, which I think is quite important. Yes, obviously was very successful, but their lineup changed every 5 minutes, apart from a few core members, and even they went for a while at one point. Genesis obviously had the dramatic departure of a singer, and then the drummer became the singer, but also still the drummer. I know it gets confusing for those who aren't initiated, but Kansas were very, very stable in their lineup. Robbie Steinhardt sadly died. The other members of this classic lineup are still alive, and a Kansas of one form or another still continues to play, but it was really those 70s albums that defined the band. Now, there have been other great prog rock bands from the US, bands that sort of defied the fusion label. There was Journey, who didn't fully defy the fusion label because of the pedigree of Greg Rowley and Neil Schon from Santana. But they were great as a prog band for 3 albums before they became known as a sort of sophisticated adult contemporary rock band when Steve Perry was added to the lineup after those first 3 albums. So that's why I hesitate to call them a prog rock band, because they're more well known for doing something similar but different. The same you could say about Styx. They were very proggy at the beginning, but they were always more on the theatrical side rather than what Kansas did, which was almost music for music's sake. And that's not to take anything for or against anyone. Styx were great. Dennis DeYoung was almost like the American Freddie Mercury, if you will. But when you really dig deep, the great fusion rock bands from the US, again, more on the jazz side, where Kansas were neither jazz influenced, nor classical influence, nor blues influence, nor country influenced. There was a bit of all of it, which is why when you put that all together, they make classic American heartland hard rock, prog hard rock, that is. The reason why there probably hasn't been a band since then is because once someone gets successful in music, the industry tends to want to put labels on everything. So, this band sounds kind of like Leonard Skinner. You're Southern rock. This band sounds a bit like a North American band trying to play English prog rock. Okay, you're prog. You're going to be the next Rush. Obviously, Canada is not the US, but it is North American prog. And the list goes on. Oh, this is a rock band, but they sound a bit like Chick Corea and Return to Forever. Your fusion. Kansas never allowed themselves to be pigeonholed into any of these categories. In fact, many people who only remember them for their big radio hits from the mid and late 70s don't even consider them a prog rock band because there's this notion that prog has to be anathema to having hits that get on the radio. Kansas had both of those things. They couldn't get arrested in terms of hits on their first 3 albums, and then after their fourth, they became staples on radio. So check out Kansas. If you haven't listened to them, I think you're going to be really, really surprised at just how good they are. I would recommend starting from the first album and working your way through, because all of the albums are very cohesive and concise, and they really tell you the full story of who this band was, what they did, and why they did it so well. Start from beginning and go to the end. That's the best. So, for those who are in Kansas still, as opposed to those who aren't there anymore, like, subscribe, listen to Kansas, and we'll see you next time.